Good morning, everyone, and welcome to all who have registered to attend our Middle East Peace Now November Forum. It's hard to believe it's already November. We would like to thank our sponsors for this event, Northfielders for Justice in Palestine, Israel, Jewish Voice for Peace, Twin Cities, American Muslims for Palestine, a special welcome to you. You are a new sponsor for us, and Women Against Military Madness. We greatly appreciate all of these organizations and your support of MEPN monthly forums. Before we begin our forum, we have a few administrative notes to share. Maddie?
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Just a reminder, all participants will be muted for the duration of this event. You're welcome to submit questions using the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we will put them in the queue. Please use the chat feature for any administrative or help questions, and we will do our best to assist you. Just a reminder to please be respectful in the chat and in the Q&A, and we do reserve the right to remove anyone who is causing harm. And then if Zoom is not working for you, please email mepn@mepn.org and we will do our best to help. And then just a reminder, this event is being recorded and will be available on MEPN's YouTube channel in the coming week. So thank you all. And Kathy Adam, fellow board member of MEPN, will introduce our speaker for the month, Miko Peled.
Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome and introduce this morning's speaker, Miko Peled. Miko is an author, writer, speaker, and human rights activist living in the United States. He is considered by many to be one of the clearest voices calling for justice in Palestine, support of the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, and the creation of a single democracy with equal rights in all historic Palestine. He is also a contributor to several online publications and produces the Miko Peled podcast, all of which he dedicated to advocating for the creation of one democratic state with equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians. His first book, The General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, is an autobiographical work taking the reader throughout the life of Peled's family since his grandparents immigrated to Palestine in the early 20th century, describing their work and their life in detail while revealing his own journey towards a defender of Palestinian rights. His second book is Injustice, the story of the Holy Land Foundation 5. He travels regularly to Palestine, where he speaks and works with popular resistance, the BDS movement, and other justice groups. As a result, he has been arrested several times by the Israeli authorities for his activism. I have heard him speak before and have read his books. He is truly an inspiration. You are in for a treat this morning. Again, welcome, Miko.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me on this morning. I'm really pleased that this coalition has decided to, puts together these lectures. I think we can't really be talking about Palestine, but we're not talking about enough. And I think to continue to discuss, to continue to act, to continue to exchange ideas on how to move the issue of Palestine forward, particularly here in the United States, it cannot be overstated. So thanks for the opportunity. Now, I live here in Washington, D.C., and one of the most striking things here in Washington, D.C. in regards to Palestine is that there is no Palestine. There's nothing representing Palestine. There's nothing advocating for Palestine. There's no building of the Palestinian flag. There used to be a PLO office in Georgetown, but that was closed. They were closed down and kicked out by Donald Trump. But even they represent the Palestinian Authority, which really can't and doesn't deal with the main issues, the crucial issues of Palestine. So we're left with yet another capital, probably the most important capital in the world, And there's no Palestine here. Palestine does not exist. Until recently, the building that used to house the PLO mission, still had the flag on the flagpole. But you can imagine what the flag looked like after 4 years of just sitting there in the exposed to the elements. It was just in tatters. It was a string. I contacted the agent, and he who's trying to sell. They're trying to sell the building. And even he was embarrassed, and so he ended up paying someone to take it off. It was just in tatters. It was an embarrassment. And so it's I think, I mean, certainly it's symbolic. I mean, the reality here is that nobody talks about Palestine, nobody cares about Palestine, and there's no real push to discuss the crucial issues that plague Palestine. And the fact that there's no flag, and whatever flag there was just, in tatters, is indicative of this reality. Now, I was in Palestine twice recently. I was there in May during the uprising. And then I was there again in July. And it's almost hard to put in words just how severe the situation is in Palestine. Because there's so little representation of Palestinian issues and Palestinian interests here in the United States, very often people will come to me and say, so, hey, it seems like everything's going great in Palestine. We're not hearing anything. Like, these guys have worked it out or something, like there's some kind of an agreement between the sides. And of course, that couldn't be farther from the truth. It's just that the situation is so severe. Israel has overpowered and continues to overpower Palestinians in a way that is so overwhelming that the Palestinian voice just cannot be heard. And of course, like I said, because there's no one here doing that, then that's the way it is here. But the situation could not be more severe. What we saw during the uprising in May, which, by the way, something you might remember, was during Ramadan. It was kind of the later part of the month of Ramadan. We saw several things. We saw an uprising that swept through all of Palestine. We saw the Nakab, the entire southern part of Palestine, 60% southern Palestine. The Palestinian Bedouin were protesting in Lid, Ramle, Jaffa, Lid in particular. There was enormous activity, enormous protest, enormous violence that was perpetrated against Palestinians. In Jerusalem, of course, in Al-Aqsa, enormous amounts of violence, the desecration of Al-Aqsa, fires burning around the mosque. I know people who were in the mosque while the worshippers were being attacked by enormous numbers of military and police, or militarized police. In Nasra, in the north, in Akka, I mean, every part of Palestine stood up. And it was as though finally they were able to throw away this, this artificial two-state solution boundaries of somehow a West Bank and a non-West Bank, as though West Bank is Palestine and everything else is Israel. This uprising showed the world, anybody who cared to watch and to pay attention, that there is one Palestine, and it's the entire historic Palestine, from the northern border with Lebanon to the Gulf of Aqaba and Rashrash, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. It is one country, it is one nation, it is Palestine, they're Palestinians, and they stood up. And just to make it absolutely clear, they were heavily punished. Thousands of Palestinian citizens of Israel who participated were arrested. Many of them were charged with security violations, so they're being treated as terror threats. The beatings, just casual beatings of Palestinian citizens of Israel on their way to work, on the streets, on campuses. I was in Be'er in the south, in the Nakab, with some Palestinian activist friends. One had just come out of 3 days of torture in the Shabak dungeons, still bruised. We went to the court in Be'er where I don't know, dozens of Palestinians were being charged. And many of these Palestinians were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So this particular place, this particular instance where I was at court, these guys were on campus at the university in Beersheba, and they were beaten by a mob of Israelis. And there was a clear movement of kind of the settler, West Bank settler movement people moving into what they call the mixed cities in 1948. So that'd be Beersheba, that'd be Yafa, Ramle, where you have both Israelis and Palestinians. And they came in, these settlers came in armed and by the hundreds, ready to beat up and kill and provoke. But that was never reported that way. It's always reported as though the Palestinians instigated violence. So it was an uprising of the likes of which we hadn't seen in a very long time. And Palestinians are being punished regardless of where they live. They're being punished the same ways: the torture, the beating, the arrests, home demolitions, and on and on. There's no difference where Palestinians live anymore. They're Palestinians, and it's obvious that the way Israelis view them, they're the enemy. And they stood up, and this was I think a great moment in the history of the Palestinian resistance. But the problem is that, and then of course there was an enormous bombing of Gaza. You know, it was people in Gaza. I was in Jerusalem while bombs were being dropped on Gaza, and I was texting with people in Gaza at the time, and people in Gaza were saying that they had never experienced anything, so many attacks and so many bombings in the past. They were saying that this one was particularly punitive and harmful, which is almost impossible to understand. Of course, many people were killed. Many civilians are killed all the time by Israel. And then there were protests. And then the protests that came after the uprising and after the bombing on Gaza ended, or even during, were really quite incredible. I mean, the numbers were unprecedented. And that's really also indicative of the problem. We always stand up and we always protest and we always speak up after the fact. And between attack and attack, there's nothing going on, or there's very little going on. And that's a big part of the problem. We, and when I say we, I mean all people of conscience, really. Anybody, people of conscience around the world. It doesn't matter if they're Palestinians or Israelis or Americans or anybody else. People of conscience need to stand up every single day with the objective of preventing the next attack, with the objective of preventing the next detention of Palestinians, preventing the next Palestinian child who's going to go through torture in the dungeons of the Israeli Shabak. And more strategically, with the intention of demanding that not a single bullet, not a single gun, not a single tank, every time Israel bombs Gaza, they need to replenish their arms. We need to make sure that not a single bomb, not a single rocket is ever sent to Israel again. And we need to start doing this right now. And if we don't stand and start making these demands, then we're going to be talking about this next year, and then the next year, and then our children are going to be talking about this, and this is going to go on and on and on. And what I see with Palestinian friends of mine, you know, almost all my Palestinian friends spent years in prison. Now their kids are spending years in prison. One of the experiences that I had, a good friend, Iyad Burnat, who many people know because he's been to the US and spoke. He's from Bil'ain. He was one of the leaders of the civil disobedience and the marches, the Friday marches in Bil'ain for years. And he was beaten and punished severely for this. And now his children were arrested. And I remember these kids when they were too young. They were so young that their dad wouldn't allow them to come to the protests. Now these 19, 20-year-olds are the ones being arrested and tortured, and two of his boys were detained, held for over 50 days. One was released after 52 days, the other with no charges. And when he was released, another friend of mine, Bassem Tamimi, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, and I went to visit him in Berlin and to see the boy. And this fine-looking young man, around 20 years old, dressed well, looks great. And Bassem asked him, so how was the arrest? How's the Mascubia? The Mascubia is where they hold Palestinians. It's the police headquarters and the Shabak torture chambers in Jerusalem. And by the way, it's right in the center of Jerusalem, surrounded by bars and restaurants and cafes and stuff. It's disgusting how close it is to how Israelis get to this and don't care. And as soon as Bassem asked him, so how's the Mascubia? You saw the look on this young man's face that was a look of horror. It was a look of such horror. It lasted a moment, but a very brief moment, but it was such horror that this kid went through hell. He was in hell and he came back somehow. And then he began describing, 20 hours of seated in extremely painful positions. And I asked him, 20 hours of interrogation a day, what do they ask you for 20 hours? And he goes, no, they don't ask you questions for 20 hours. You sit in the room for 20 hours. And every so often somebody comes in, asks you questions and leaves you. And the entire time, of course, you're exposed to light and noise. And so now it's a whole new generation. And this was true, by the way, in 1948 Palestine. It's a whole new generation. It's a whole new generation of young Palestinians who are now standing up and protesting and being tortured and beaten and killed. And how many more generations are we going to allow this to continue? Because at the end of the day, there's not going to be somebody else who's going to stop it. It has to be us. If we act, there's a chance it will stop. If we don't act, it's never going to stop. And Israel is on a mission. And when we look back at the last 100 years, it's obvious that Israel and the Zionist movement in general are on a mission, and they are very, very successful. They won the PR war, in a spectacular way. They won the military war in a spectacular way. They're destroying the country to eliminate anything that might remind people that there was a Palestinian history, and they're doing it wholesale. It's one of those things, again, that goes, under the radar, unnoticed, nobody talks about, but the country is being monuments, cemeteries, mosques. We know about, entire villages and towns that had a huge, rich history being completely destroyed and demolished. And the only history that people talk about is not really a history, but it's kind of the biblical Zionist mythology. The Jews were there, the Jews came back, and nothing else happened in Palestine ever really of any kind of significance. So Israel is winning spectacularly on all fronts. Unless we stand up and reverse that, nothing's going to change. Now, I mentioned Al-Aqsa because the attacks on Al-Aqsa in May were far worse. The desecration was far worse than anything they've done before. And they've attacked and they've shot and they've been, they've gone into the mosque many, many times and shot people and so on. But this was during Ramadan. And to do this during Ramadan is taking everything to a whole new level. And I want to talk about Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem for just a moment. If you've been to Jerusalem, there's these alleys, all these streets that lead to Al-Aqsa, but they're open only for Muslims. And if you want to go as a guest, there are visiting hours, and you need to go through the Western Wall, through the Jewish quarter, and then there's a bridge that leads up to the grounds of Al-Aqsa. And you used to just be able to, go through a simple security check and you go through that bridge. So I went. But now you walk up the bridge, and about halfway up the bridge, they stop you. and it's a closed bridge, it's a covered bridge. They stop you and you have to wait for a tour with an enormous military escort or police escort, but heavily armed police. They look like military. And in that space where you wait, there's an enormous model of the new temple, the third temple, the Jewish temple that is to be built instead of Al-Aqsa. And then you wait, and these tours are just really tours for these settler types who are praying for the destruction of Al-Aqsa and the building of a new temple. So it's a whole movement. And this is what it is. I was shocked. So I had to stay there, wait for the, I guess they wait for a certain number of people, and off you go with this enormous, enormous armed entourage. And even though they say you're not supposed to pray, you're not supposed to wear religious symbols, every few meters they stop and pray. And the entire trip is really about prayer. It's about them going on the Al-Aqsa compound and engaging in a religious service or religious ceremony. And then there's a particular place where they stop for about half an hour, protected by the police. And I asked one of the cops, I said, what are we doing here? Why are we, I thought we're not supposed to pray. The prayer is not allowed, because they say this before you enter the grounds. And he's just like, shrugged his head, shrugged his shoulders. And I said, how long is it going to take? And he said, well, a few more minutes, and then the tour is over soon anyway. Another thing that happens during these tours is the compound is completely closed to anybody else. It's like, it's abandoned. It looks like it's abandoned. It's very strange, because if you've ever been there, there are always a lot of people. Teachers bring their classrooms there. People go there bring their kids for a picnic. Kids play around. It's enormous ground. It's beautiful. And people use it. People work there. People, of course, come to worship. And it was desolate, except for these settlers who are absolute loonies, and me, and this enormous entourage of armed police. Now, 20, 30 years ago, everybody knew there was a small group of the Temple Mount loyalists, and the Temple Mount Institute and movement, and they were a bunch of crazies that wanted to build a temple. Over the last couple of decades, this movement has become incredibly, incredibly big and popular, to the point that even the Israeli TV did a documentary about them and revealed that over the last couple of years, these tours had over 50, 60, 80,000 people taking these tours. And these are regular, non-religious Israelis. And then after I came back from this tour, from this very, very bizarre experience, I mean, the place is enormously beautiful. I mean, it's really spectacular if you've not been there. But several thoughts came to me as I was thinking about this, as I was kind of going through this in my head. First one was that actually the destruction of Al-Aqsa and the building of a temple is a big part of the secular national Zionist project. It is something that has been injected into all Israelis. I'll give you a few examples. I remember as a child, we used to sing these silly folk songs, and many of them talked about the day where we build the temple, where we rebuild the temple, and we celebrate our holidays at the temple. I'm not talking about religious people. I'm talking about completely secular Israelis. Then I was thinking about the time of the 1967 war, the Six-Day War. And I was asking other Israelis this as well. What is the most iconic sentence, the one thing that everybody remembers from that war? And it's this one sentence that, again, became iconic. When the commander of the Israeli paratroopers took Jerusalem, when they got up onto to Al-Aqsa, he said over the radio, Har Habayit biyadenu, the Temple Mount is in our hands. And I'm not a religious man, and so on and so forth, but this is a great moment for our people, for our history. We have returned, and so on and so forth. In other words, this has nothing to do with religion. This is a national, secular national Zionist. One of the objections one of the goals, one of the objectives of this movement, of the State of Israel. And it goes across religious, secular, Ashkenazi, Sephardic. I mean, it crosses all the different parts of Israeli society. And I did this experiment. I just asked people, what do you remember from the war? What is the one thing that springs to mind? Even people who were not alive then. Oh, yeah, that one sentence that this particular commander said over the radio when they took the Temple Mount of the Al-Aqsa compound. And then I don't know if people here are familiar with the famous song, Jerusalem of Gold. And it was written by Israel's most popular songwriter, Naomi Shemer, and who also happened to be a family friend, a close family friend. And when she wrote the song, it became enormously popular. The song was commissioned 2 weeks before the war. And as some of you may know, there was an enormous push to promote the idea of the war. There was, the Israeli government were hesitant, the military and others wanted the war, the 1967 war, to start the war. And this song was obviously part of the propaganda to push for the war. And it talked about, this Jerusalem, this wonderful city who is sitting desolate on a hill. Nobody visits the marketplaces. Nobody worships on the Temple mounds. The water wells have dried up. And of course, we know that millions of Palestinians were frequenting this before 1967. So that was the song. It came out 2 weeks before the war. It was incredibly popular. About a month later, in other words, a few weeks after the war, she added a few stanzas where she made some changes, where she says, now the streets of the marketplace are full. They're bustling with people. The water wells are flowing again. And now we see the worshipers back on Har HaBayit, back on the Temple Mount. And she was a completely secular Zionist Israeli. So this idea of destroying Al-Aqsa and building a temple is not a fringe radical idea. It is a consensus. It's part of the Zionist national consensus. It's one of the objectives. And as we look at Palestine in general, like I said earlier, mosques and ancient cemeteries and churches and anything that demonstrates that there was a history that is not the Zionist narrative, not the history that the Zionist narrative tries to push forward, but an actual other history, a Palestinian history, anything that demonstrates that is being either allowed to fall into disrepair or being destroyed. You may have seen there was a video that came out a week or two ago of a mother holding on to the grave of her son as Israeli forces are destroying this Muslim cemetery in Jerusalem. This is part of that. They're destroying all these historic cemeteries. They're just throwing out the bones of families and people who, have been burying their loved ones there for 1,000 years or more. And they're building a biblical park or something. And it's part of this Judaizing of all Jerusalem, Zionizing and Bibliizing, if you will, the narrative and what you see when you visit Jerusalem. So they're reducing anything that has to do with Palestine, and they're aggrandizing anything that has to do with the biblical narrative, the biblical mythology. Al-Aqsa is, of course, very high profile, a little more complicated. But during the month of May, when the Israeli troops were storming the mosque, there was a particular day where there were thousands of Israeli youth in the plaza near the Western Wall, in front of the Western Wall, dancing and singing. And because of the shooting and the grenades and the stun grenades and tear gas that was being shot inside and around the mosque, there was a fire that broke out right next to the mosque. So there was this visual of a fire next to the mosque and thousands of young Israelis dancing with the Israeli flag right below it. And I don't know how that did not just create a sense of enormous fear in everybody around the world. that is the doomsday scenario. That's exactly what it's going to look like. And it's going in that direction. It's heading in that direction with tremendous speed. It is not going to take much for Israel to allow Al-Aqsa to be destroyed and then proceed to build this temple. It's part of the consensus. The people who were once these fringe religious lunatics are now not only in the Knesset, but many of them are in the government now. I mean, the prime minister was the chairman of the West Bank settlers movement. Not that Netanyahu before him was any different, any worse, but I mean, he wears a kippah, so he's kind of a religious man, so that kind of adds a little bit to it. I'm sure Netanyahu would have no problem seeing Al-Aqsa burn and building a temple in it instead. One representing, Netanyahu representing this kind of secular Israeli Zionist fascism, and the other one, Bennett, representing the more religious Zionist form of Zionist fascism. And really, that's the only discourse that takes place now in Israel, is between these two groups. I mean, there are the religious Zionist fascists, and then there are the secular Zionist fascists, and they're just vying for power. Who gets to sit in the seat in terms of policy, in terms of how they see Palestine and the history and the future? There's no difference, really. So in terms of our concern for the future of Palestine, it makes no difference who sits in the prime minister's chair. But if we look at the way Zionists have operated over the last 75 years and even more, there's always a small group of somehow more radical, more zealot young people that create the facts on the ground, and then the more official establishment agrees. And if it's too egregious, maybe they'll distance themselves first and then they'll accept it. The massacre of Deir Yassin, for example, in 1948. At first, the official, establishment kind of distanced themselves from it, but then, of course, they didn't do anything to prevent other massacres, and they kind of, took advantage of the benefits of the massacre, if you will. The same thing when the settlements began in the West Bank after 1967. The small group of radicals started it, and then the government came in and said, you know what, actually, we support it. And of course they supported it, even though supposedly ideologically there was some kind of a difference between them. And this is what's going to happen now. It's going to be some fluke, some accident, and I've seen plenty of fires started by tear gas canisters. And there'll be a fire, and forget for a moment the religious significance of Al-Aqsa. Think of this structure that has been crowning this city, Jerusalem, for 1,500 years. It's glorious, it's magnificent, it's beautiful, it's historically so significant. I mean, I thought, okay, let's see, what do we compare it to? Compare, for example, say the Taj Mahal, which is much young, not as old, not as significant, and I think not nearly as beautiful. Imagine if there was a movement to destroy the Taj Mahal and build something else instead. I mean, people would think it was absurd. Here, in Jerusalem, in Al-Aqsa, in the case of Al-Aqsa, I'm telling you, in all honesty, this is where this is going. Now, the fact that nobody's noticing the lead up only makes it worse, because people aren't realizing that there is a lead up to this. Other important mosques, other important monuments have been either destroyed or allowed to fall into disrepair. Al-Aqsa is a national symbol that Israelis are crying to see it destroyed. Now, for most of us, we see Al-Aqsa, we see the Golden Dome, the Dome of the Rock, we think, wow, this is glorious. They see it as an eyesore. They want to build and then operate this thing that they call a Jewish temple. And by the way, there are government-sponsored programs where young people who choose not to go to the army but choose national service instead can opt to go to be taught and trained on how to operate the temple once it's in place, how to conduct the slaughter of the sheep and how to conduct the slaughter of the cows, and what to do with the blood and where to put the incense. I mean, how to operate this whole thing, and where do the priests go? So there's a government program with thousands of young Israelis who are being trained on how to operate this temple once it's there. Government sponsored, never mind all these other billions of dollars that go into this movement as a movement. But all of this just to say the situation in Palestine is so severe and is getting more and more severe by the day. And all we hear about is from time to time, oh, Israel approved another 3,000 units of housing units in East Jerusalem. Or, from time to time, we'll hear about hunger strikers when it actually reaches the news. It doesn't often reach the news, but, hunger strikers. Or maybe some egregious form of, I don't know, Israel bombed Gaza. We hear about that, but we don't really talk about anything else. We don't hear about anything else. I'll say what I said earlier. Again, we are, I don't know how to say this. If we do not step up, if we do not demand of our elected officials that they distance themselves, at least, if not totally reject Zionism and the state of Israel, then we are failing our duty as people of conscience. Anybody who runs for office, school board, city council, sheriff, state legislatures, and of course, national office, must hear from us, must understand that we demand sanctions against Israel, that we demand boycott against Israel, that we demand that not a single bullet, not a single gun, tank, warplane, or any other instrument of death be sent to Israel ever again, not a single dollar go to the state of Israel ever again, or that particular elected official will be shamed, will be exposed as a supporter of racism and violence and brutality against innocent people. We need to step up our game, or else there will never be any change. Elected officials need to be scared to say they support Israel. They need to be terrified that somebody will associate them with Zionism. They need to do everything they possibly can to make sure we know that they reject Israel, and they will do everything they can to stop sending money and weapons to this monstrous apartheid regime that is murdering Palestinians, murdering children, murdering women, murdering innocent civilians, and destroying what is a glorious history, a country with an enormously important and made enormous contributions to the world throughout history, throughout thousands of years. That is what is imperative. That is what we must be doing, not go out and protest after the fact. The people in Gaza were already dead by the time everybody was out protesting. The bombs had fallen. Hamas is not the issue. When I flew in May, Hamas, the Qassam rockets were everywhere. So the airport wasn't closed, but none of the airlines were flying in. So I was rerouted. I flew to Amman and I crossed overland, which adds a couple of days to the trip. But the major airport of the state of Israel was not functioning for about 10 days or 2 weeks. And then we're surprised that people, support Hamas. We need to demand that airlines don't fly to Tel Aviv, period, because they boycott Tel Aviv. Not wait for Hamas from Gaza, where people have barely food to eat and water to drink and medicine for their children if they have a toothache, not demand they do it. We need to initiate it. We do nothing, and when Palestinians act, they get blamed for using violence. If we acted, they wouldn't need to do this. If we were in the streets before the attack, if we were in the offices of our elected officials before the attack, they wouldn't need to do this. And then be blamed for using armed resistance, for using violence. What are they expected to do? If we did our job, Tel Aviv airport would be desolate. Not through rockets, but through people, voting with their feet, saying we will not use airlines that go to Tel Aviv. In the 2021 Olympics in Tokyo, there was a judo practitioner from Algeria who refused to compete against the Israeli team member. Now, if we stop for a moment to think how hard he must have worked to get to the Olympics. And he said, no, I will not shake hands. I will not get on the mat with a member of the Israeli team. And it was an enormous sacrifice. He was thrown out of the Olympics, and he and his coach were suspended from any judo competitions for the next 10 years. Well, that means it's the end of his career as an Olympic athlete. That's an enormous sacrifice, a personal sacrifice. But until the Olympic Committee stands up and bans Israel from participating in the Olympics, that's what needs to be done. Athletes need to refuse to participate in the Olympics as long as the state of Israel is allowed to participate. And they need to refuse to get on the mat or get on the field or whatever field they're in, refuse to participate in any event that includes an Israeli team member. If we do these things, which are not violent, which are not armed, where nobody gets hurt, the Palestinians wouldn't have to, shoot rockets out of Gaza. But we tend not to, obviously we're not doing this. So what's left? And really, there's a lot more the Palestinians do than shoot rockets out of Gaza. I mean, the Palestinians are resisting as best they can. But if 3 Palestinians wanted to get together from 3 parts of the country, say one from Jerusalem, one from Lid, one from Hebron, they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it, number one, because logistically it's impossible. It's illegal because of the checkpoints. And within 5 minutes, between the secret police of the Palestinian Authority and the secret police of the Israelis, they'd be put in jail. We can do this. We can meet anywhere we want. We can talk about anything we want. We can put together a strategy. We can find a house here in Washington, D.C., put a big Palestinian flag and make it a center for Palestinian activity. I'm not talking about reopening the PLO office, which is completely useless, but not completely. I mean, they do deal with visa issues that help Palestinians a little bit. But in terms of these larger issues, they never deal with refugees. They never deal with prisoners. We don't see members of Congress getting briefings about the situation of refugees, about demanding that Resolution 194 be implemented. And by the way, an excellent book that came out, more like a research paper about a year ago, called The Palestinians in International Law. The Palestinian Refugees in International Law. And I wrote about it, and I interviewed the writers in one of my webinars earlier last year, if anybody wants to check it out. Resolution 194 is one of the most important historic resolutions in the history of the United Nations. It has been reaffirmed more than any other resolution in the history of the United Nations. And in this book, it speaks precisely of what was taken and what Palestinians deserve to get back. I don't know if there are any Palestinians in the audience, but in Arabic, they say, "Akhaduha mafrusha." They stole it furnished. They took it fully furnished. The Nakab, the Bedouins in the Nakab were exporting barley to England. When we look at aerial photos of the Nakab, which people think is a desert, it is a desert, but it's a fertile desert. You see enormous tracts of cultivated land. I'm talking about, when the British occupation began. Throughout history, Palestinians were exporting cotton and olive oil to Europe, cotton to the garment industry in the UK. It was a powerhouse. There were cities, spaces, public spaces. They stole the produce from the fields. They stole money that was in the banks. They stole institutions and they stole agricultural machinery. They took everything, not just the houses, the land, and the water. It's estimated in billions and billions of dollars what the Zionists stole when they took Palestine in 1948. They didn't take a barren land and made it bloom. They took a country that was in full bloom and stole it. That's what the Zionists did. They didn't make the desert bloom. They only caused destruction. And now the Bedouin Palestinians in the Nakab are forbidden to engage in agriculture, while the wealthiest agriculture communities and the wealthiest cities in Israeli cities and towns and farms are in the Nakab. The highest standard of living among Israelis is in the Nakab. And the poorest Palestinians who are prohibited from building on their land, from cultivating their lands and so forth. Another thing I did an interview with this wonderful city councilwoman from the city of Lid. And maybe I'll finish with this because we're kind of running out of time. But and if you check out my Patreon page, her name is Fidash Hada, incredibly courageous young woman. And during the uprising in May, she came to some prominence because she was out there, talking to the press a lot, because a lot was taking place in Lid, and hundreds, about 500 settlers, came into Lid, settled in the city, in the city hall, armed, and they were there to kill and provoke, and they killed a Palestinian. 2 Palestinians were shot. 1 was killed, 1 was seriously injured, and there's been no investigation, of course. So I interviewed her, and we went through the city. She took me on a tour. We went around, and we were talking about home demolitions. And she remembers as a younger woman seeing home demolitions and wondering about that, and that drove her to study city planning, and then come back to the city and run for city council. And then she challenged the mayor, who was a racist, fascist settler type. And we're talking about home demolitions, and she was saying that there are currently some 40,000 home demolition orders. And I said, wow, that's a lot. Is that, that's for all of Palestine? She said, no, that's not all of Palestine. It does not include the Nakab, which is 60% of the country, because the Nakab is governed by a separate bureaucracy. And the Nakab alone, over the last few years, they've demolished over 2,000 homes per year. And that's the ones demolished. It's not the ones that have a demolition order. These 40,000 orders don't include the Nakab, don't include the West Bank, don't include Jerusalem. It's just for the 1948 northern part, from the center moving up. Less than half, I don't know, maybe a fourth of the population of Palestine, Palestinian population of Palestine. The violence, the racism, the brutality, the incredibly one-sided racist discourse, the lack of any really serious dissent is mind-blowing. It's insane. It's Sparta. That's really the only way to describe Israel. And unless we, and I said this earlier and I'll say this again, unless we stand up, unless we demand our elected officials to completely distance themselves, reject Israel and Zionism, unless we demand that they do everything in their power to make sure not a single dollar, not a single bullet goes to Israel ever again, things are going to get progressively worse because there's no status quo. It's an ongoing, it's like Roman legions going through the country and ruining everything in sight. That's what is happening in Palestine, from the north to the south, from the east to the west. Israel is destroying everything it possibly can. So I want to encourage everybody to get up, invite people to get up and do things. I think that the possibility, the future of Palestine can be promising. The history of Palestine was glorious. I don't know if you've ever seen or read the book by Nur Masalha, the Palestinian historian Nur Masalha. It's called Palestine, a 4,000-Year History. Read it. One of the things he demonstrates in that book is that the name Palestine has been used to describe that country going back 4,000 years. The Egyptians, the Greeks, Aristotle, Herodotus, on and on and on, the Assyrians have always referred to this country by the name Palestine. And then he talks about the details as well. I mean, the details of the history, which are remarkable. It's a remarkable country. Had a glorious history. And so the future can be bright because Palestine is a great place and a lot of great people live there. But it's governed by a radical, racist, violent regime, which is called the State of Israel. And just like people stood up against apartheid in South Africa, they should stand up against Israel in Palestine. The entire structure, the entire power structure needs to change. Palestine needs to be decolonized. It needs to be democratized. We need to stop all these ridiculous conversations about a two-state solution or a separation or anything that gives any legitimacy to the State of Israel. The State of Israel should be completely delegitimized. Zionist ideology should be completely delegitimized. Anyone who recognizes or who consider themselves a Zionist should not be allowed a seat at the table. Just like anybody who is a fascist or a white supremacist is not allowed a seat at the table. And we need to change the narrative, change the story to a place where people realize that Zionism needs to be in the same column as all other forms of racism and fascism and supremacy. Not only is it not anti-Semitic to oppose Zionism, it's anti-Semitic to support Zionism. It's racist. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism. If you support, anybody who supports Zionism is supporting racism. And talk to Orthodox Jews about how they suffer from the Zionists and how they've opposed Zionism from the very beginning and why. It's a whole other issue that I'm working on a book about that right now. It's an incredible story of courage and foresight by the entire ultra-Orthodox community around the world that saw very early on that Zionism will bring only violence to the Holy Land and ruin the good relations that used to exist between Jews and Arabs and Jews and Muslims, not only in Palestine and the rest of the Arab world too, but particularly in Palestine. So it's insulting to even engage in the conversation of whether or not opposing Zionism is anti-Semitic. But supporting racism can be somehow construed as good for Jewish people? Zionism is a racist ideology. It belongs in the same column as all other racist, fascist, supremacist ideologies. It should be opposed completely. And this entire conversation of whether or not it's anti-Semitic should be set aside. It's an insult to anybody who ever suffered from racism or anti-Semitism to engage in this conversation. So going back to my summation, I'll say I want to invite everybody to participate in the struggle. I want to invite everybody to demand that elected officials be part of the struggle. We have to change the way things are done here in Washington, D.C. We have to change the way any congressman, like I said, any elected official views this issue and acts on this issue. And we need to set in front of our eyes this image of a free, democratic Palestine with equal rights, with the right of return. This great organization, Zochrot, has a project called Envision Return, where they're envisioning the return, where young Palestinians are kind of, creating images of what the villages will look like once the return happens, once they're rebuilt, how the return will happen, and demand a conversation about the return, about the prisoners, about justice, about equality, and about a free, democratic Palestine. Or as somebody wrote somewhere, make Israel Palestine again. Then we will all see the peace and the justice that we're looking for. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miko. I think your summation, it sets the bar at where we have to be if we want to be working for the freedom of Palestinians. I think being any lower than that bar, it's not going to work. Because as I've heard saying, it's like Palestinians are falling off a cliff and no one is there to catch. And the way the US generally moves is very slow comparatively to how fast the oppression is happening. So I just appreciate the bar you are setting and your tenacity. I have a question. Oh, by the way, I'm Maya. I'm one of the board members of MEPN. I'm with Jewish Voice for Peace Twin Cities. Ruben from Jewish Voice for Peace Twin Cities says, thank you for your intense and passionate perspective. Can you speak about your experience and perhaps strategies and approaches as a Jew speaking out against Israel's policies, behavior, and atrocities? I am a US Jew who speaks out, and I regularly experience rejection, hatred, and anger. How do we effectively create an effective community that has a chance of opposing the monumental force you warn us is successfully erasing Palestinians from their land?
Wow, well, thanks for that, for saying that. And it's good to know it's good to know we're on the same side. You know, I don't know that I have all the answers to that. I do think that the key for those of us who live here in this country is to challenge elected officials. I know in Canada, they had a Vote Palestine campaign. I don't know if you heard about it. They had elections recently. And any candidate that came knocking on somebody's door was invited in, they sat him down and they talked to him about Palestine. I think that's the right approach. I think anybody who wants our vote needs to hear us, and you need to hear us loud and clear and in no uncertain terms what it is that we're demanding. That's the only way we're going to change the reality. That's the only way we're going to change the story. I think it's important to create alliances. I think the struggle for Palestine, the struggle for Black lives, the struggle for people of color in general, the struggle of Native Americans, this is all the same struggle. And so these alliances are incredibly important, and the Zionists know this, and they're ahead of us already because they're in the Black churches and they're in the Latino churches, and they're already out there, you know, pretending that they are the ADL, pretending that it's some kind of a civil rights organization, where in fact it's a racist, fascist organization. So they're ahead of us, and they've been ahead of us for a very long time. So we need a lot of catching up to do. So I think creating these alliances and making it clear to our elected officials that we're not going to take this anymore. They need to be challenged. They need to be challenged in a big way. We need to talk also. We need to talk to our neighbors. We need to talk to our family members. I mean, again, whether we're Jewish or not Jewish, everybody knows somebody who they don't want to bring the subject up because they might be offended. If people who are not Jewish say, well, we have my best friend is Jewish or my brother-in-law is Jewish, and so I don't want to bring this up. Bring it up. Bring it up. Absolutely bring it up, and have a bi-weekly or a monthly group meet at your house to discuss this. I mean, anything from a book club to an actual political action, kind of a little activist group, it's all important. That's how we spread the word, but we have to actually do it. You know, how many Arab stores in Minnesota carry Israeli products? I guarantee you most of them do. I guarantee you that most of them do. And we buy them. Maybe not Sabra Hummus because that's kind of a big label, but a lot of other stuff, you know, and many of the store, people own the store, they don't care, the stuff sells, that's fine. You know, we need to up our game. We need to make our views known and be far less polite than we have been. Because what's at stake here is nothing but the total destruction of Palestine and its people, you know. And the other side of it is to keep in mind and to state very clearly, a free democratic Palestine from the river to the sea will do nothing but good for anyone who lives in Palestine. It'll do nothing but good. It's not going to be easy. Israelis are going to be scared. They might have to give up some of their privileges, God forbid, you know, maybe suffer a little discomfort. Payments are going to have to be made to Palestinians for sure. But, you know, Israel gets almost $4 billion a year from the US, so money is not an issue. You know, there's a lot that has to be done, and I'm sure Israelis are going to be, you know, there's going to be some discomfort. But this is going to be the best thing that ever happened since this new thing called Israelis was invented. I mean, Israelis are a new invention, kind of like white South Africans. The white South Africans are not that new, but I mean, it's an invention that took place as a result of settler colonialism. We're a new thing. There used to be Jewish people, Polish Jews and I don't know, Russian Jews and Spanish Jews and Arab Jews, Iraqi Jews. Now there's this new thing called Israeli Jews. And this would be the best thing that ever happened to them, to live in a real pluralistic, democratic society, in a real state that promotes not violence and racism, but openness and friendship and collaboration. And then think of the impact on other countries around Palestine. It's going to do nothing but good. So that would be my, I don't know that I have all the answers to all that, but I think this is, I think that, these are some ideas. And also there's a lot of great material out there, a lot of great speakers, a lot of great literature by Palestinians. Check out Ibrahim Nasrallah. He wrote many, many books, but a couple of them that are just magnificent books about Palestine in big sagas. And of course there's Nur Masalha's book that I mentioned and others. So there's a lot of material out there that many of us are not exposed to. So I would recommend, and by the way, on my website, I have a list of a lot of these books and a list of a lot of good references. And both on my website, you can check out the Patreon page, you can check out the webinars, and there are a lot of great people there that you can invite to speak by Zoom, or you can invite them personally if you're doing the open events. There are a lot of resources that and again, I try to make the website as a resource for people. But we need to expand the circle to a point that elected officials understand that, there's a new sheriff in town, the rules of the game have changed, and we have to change the rules of the game.
Thank you. I think you said a lot of really key things, intersectionality, and also like the fact that I feel in the US, we're so hesitant to say what we have to say, if you know what I mean. Like we set the bar lower to make it people comfortable, but that's setting the bar too low for how drastically things need to change. So I really appreciate you saying the things, how they need to be said, and helping a narrative for people to come from this forum and they can say it to their government officials and friends, because we need to confidently demand for these things. We have a question from Judy asking a good clarifying question on how does the Palestinian Authority operate? Is it a legitimate government organization?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The Palestinian Authority has zero legitimacy. It's a contractor that was designed and created in order to do Israel's dirty work. They arrest Palestinian activists. They shoot at Palestinian protesters. Their secret police is all over the place, making sure that anybody who speaks up against anything that has to do with the occupation or the PA itself gets arrested. They put pressure on people's families if they are activists. The story of Nazar al-Banat that was killed a few months ago, that made it to the news. That was an extreme case, but he was beaten to death by the Palestinian Authority. I don't know that there's been any serious investigation or anybody was held responsible. But they're the finger that pulls the trigger in many ways, and so. They have zero legitimacy and they have zero respect. I mean, the only reason anybody still remains a member of Fatah, for example, is either because of, it's kind of the old boys club and you don't want to, ruffle any feathers, or you get paid. For a lot of people, being part of the PLO, part of Fatah, is because they need it for their livelihood. That's where the money is. That's where the power is. But they have no legitimacy, certainly no respect, and no significance whatsoever, other than maintaining the current situation. But they are an obstacle, and I think the sooner they go, the sooner things are going to be better for everybody. And they allow also this impression that somehow there's a Palestinian state, that somehow there's an entity, that somehow there's an Israel and a Palestine, which of course is not true. The Palestinian Authority has less authority than a small city council. So they have no legitimacy whatsoever, not in the eyes of Palestinians.
Agreed. Yeah. Have you read or heard of Andy Clarno's book, Neoliberal Apartheid?
No.
it's really good at but I would say for anyone who wants to understand the history of the PA, that is a really good book to go to. It talks about also South Africa. We have a good question about local politics here from Kathy. How would you suggest that we who are in Ilhan Omar's constituents work with her?
Well, let's make sure she gets reelected when the time comes, because I've heard recently that her opponents are already tagging her as the anti-Semitic candidate. And I would encourage her as much as possible and beyond that, and raising the bar as high as possible to make sure she speaks her mind about Zionism, that she speaks her mind about, that she feels safe to say what there is to really say. Not to be afraid to be called anti-Semitic. I'll tell you a little story. When the first time she was accused of being anti-Semitic, friends of mine from the ultra-Orthodox community up in New York called me up, and some of you may have seen them. They come to pro-Palestine events, ultra-Orthodox Jews with their beards and their black clothes, and they wear banners and hold big posters, talk about a free Palestine and anti-Zionist slogans. So they called me up. They said they're coming down to DC and they want to stand up. They usually stand outside Congress with signs. I said, why stand outside? Why don't you come into the halls and go into her office? And there were maybe 30, maybe 50, I can't remember. There were a lot of them. And I think it was the first time people inside Rayburn, where the congressional offices saw these people. And it's quite a sight if you've never seen it. People are clearly visibly Jews, Orthodox Jews, with banners and kafiyas and saying free Palestine, and we pray for the dismantlement of the peaceful dismantlement of the state of Israel, that sort of thing. And they went to her office, and she wasn't there, but they went to her office, met with the chief of staff, made a statement. Jewish people are okay with politicians standing up against Israel. And she needs to know that. And she needs to feel secure enough and safe enough in making that statement. And to know that if those Jews came to her office, made the effort to drive all the way down from New York to come and express their support for her, then that's a big thing. It's not a small thing for these people, because, the Zionists are all over the place, and the Zionists are beating them up too. But whether we're Orthodox Jews, whether we're secular Jews, whether we're whatever we are, I think it's really, really important that she feels safe enough and understands why it's important to stand up, not just against the occupation, not just against a particular Israeli policy or prime minister, but to completely reject Zionism and push for that more progressive part of the Democratic Party to go in that direction of a complete rejection of Zionism. So that somebody like, so if there's a Democratic president like Joe Biden, he can't stand up and say, I'm a Zionist. He can't meet with Naftali Bennett, that sort of thing. So it's tough. I'm not saying it's easy, because like I said, I've already heard that her opponents are tagging her as the anti-Semitic, and that's probably going to be what they go with. But it's going to be, so it's extremely important, I think, to keep her in office and to support her, but also to make sure that this is, she has this confidence that she can go that way and do the work that needs to be done.
Thank you. Yeah. And then when she gets reelected, push her to fix her language.
Absolutely.
I will say that district loves Ilhan. I'm hoping but that district seems to really love her. And this is not new that they make her anti-Semitic.
Yeah. A Muslim Black woman wearing a hijab in Congress and being as gutsy and mouthy in a good way as she is, I think it's a blessing. God, I wish I was in her district. That's exactly what we want. And we need to be there to support her so that she can speak freely and really push the limits, which nobody else dares to push.
Yeah.
Uncompromisingly.
Truly. And we try our best to let her know that we are behind her. But I do think that sometimes people are starting, even though we're a big deal with JVP, in general, but I think people see us and like, oh, you're JVP. And then they want to talk to other voices
Yeah.
which becomes problematic.
Yeah.
But we have, speaking of on that route, we have a question from Claudette asking, how is your voice currently being heard in DC? Have you been called upon as a resource on the Capitol? On Capitol Hill?
No, I have a lot of friends, a lot of allies here in DC, but it's all outside the Capitol, beltway. I never go there willingly, and I've gone there before just because there was a meeting or something, but no, nobody. I think they're quite happy to keep distance from somebody who speaks the way I do. But that's precisely what needs to change. Not for me personally, but for the views that the views that I voice, and for other people who voice these views, and because this is this is all about the Palestinian issue. Nobody dares to do that. I will say that, when Secretary of State Blinken was in Palestine, he met with this was again when I was there in July. A good friend of mine, Issa Amro from Hebron, was invited to a meeting with him. And that was a big deal because Issa Amro is a serious activist. We agree, we hold the same, opinions. And we've been friends for a long time. And there was a group of activists. And then the ones that went, like Issa, were attacked by Breitbart, and they were attacked by Palestinians, and they were attacked by everybody because, there's a boycott and they shouldn't meet with Blinken. I'm thinking, in your mind, the Secretary of State wants to hear from these people. Of course you go. So that was a good step, and that was unique. But of course, I think he felt safe doing it in Palestine, where not really a lot of people pay attention. To do it here in Washington, D.C. is maybe a little trickier. But I've not been asked to come. Although outside that the beltway of the Capitol, I'm in touch with a lot of people who are also quite conservative in their political views, who invite me to speak and invite me to panels and want to talk more and have a tendency to agree with a lot of what I say on this issue. So I think there is a possibility of maybe a somewhat bipartisan agreement on this issue, because at the end of the day, nobody's benefiting from, weapons manufacturers are benefiting from this. But at the end of the day, people who care about issues in general can be made to understand that this is not a partisan issue. I want to ask a question though, you guys all remember Hussein al-Khatib from Minnesota? He was, I mentioned him in my book. He was a good friend. He passed away a couple of years ago. And I mentioned him in my book, Injustice. He did a lot of great work in Palestine when he was there working for the Holy Land Foundation. So I don't know if anybody of you know him or remember him, but I always like to, remember him when I talk to people from Minnesota. He was a great, great man. Loved him dearly.
Thank you. Yeah, I personally was not in Minnesota during that time, but maybe someone else was here. Following up with that, we have, as you know, how we get the same rhetoric every time when we try to talk about Palestine. It's the same questions. And I guess this might be a good time for you to demonstrate how you would answer those questions. How can Americans help to interrupt the false narrative around creation and existence of Israel? For example, no one was there before Israel anyways. The Holocaust justifies the existence of Israel. Poor little Israel being in geographic area of enemies. Etc. And this is asked by one of our board members.
Yeah. Well, talking about the creation, there's a great movie called 1948, Creation and Catastrophe. And tomorrow I'm going to be on a panel. I'm going to be on a panel discussing that movie. And so I strongly recommend, if you want, I can email you the link to the movie and then to the discussions if anybody wants to watch it. But it's a very telling documentary about 1948. So I really recommend it. It's a very good movie. And it talks about, was it a creation or catastrophe, and how catastrophic it was, and how even very, very liberal Zionists agree that, how shall I say, we had to do what we had to do. And we don't want the Arabs back anyway, because we want to have a majority. So even these liberal Zionists who sometimes seem like they're actually okay, they're willing to talk about peace. They're very insincere. But it's a good movie to watch because it touches on that. Like I said, if anybody wants to join tomorrow, there's going to be a good discussion I'm discussing, and the Palestinian woman who made the movie is going to be there as well.
Sorry, I'll put the link to the movie in the chat,
Sure,
so everyone can see
yeah.
it there. It's
Yeah,
Voices from the Holy Land.
if you go to Voices from the Holy Land is the organization that's putting together this whole event.
Perfect.
And if you go to their
November
website, find their
14th.
website. If you go to their website, I'm sure you'll find the event, and people can just, yeah.
Yep, I've got it. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. Now, all these questions are, they come from a memo that comes down from, to all the Zionist organizations, anybody who wants to discuss that. I mean, even at Tel Aviv airport, one time I found a flyer, which is kind of like a guide to how to talk about Israel when you're overseas, for people who are going overseas and might be, might have to engage in these conversations. And I've become maybe a little cynical, but anybody who says that there was nobody there or that Israel made the desert bloom, I mean, how do you deal with ignorance? If somebody's that ignorant that they don't know, then they should read a book or watch a documentary or read the history. I mean, it's so blatantly stupid. These arguments are so blatantly, clearly empty of any kind of intelligence. They're just so completely stupid. If there was nobody there, then how are there 5.5 million refugees today? What a load of nonsense. If there were no Palestinians, then how is it that these people have been called Palestinians and the name Palestine is on every single map until 1948, until May of 1948? Who built these magnificent monuments, and who lived there, and who built these magnificent cities? Haifa, Jaffa, not to mention Jerusalem, Al-Quds, Tabariya, Bir Saba in the south, the tracts of cultivated land before 1948, and it goes on and on and on. But it's just a question of people wanting to push this very narrow-minded, very myopic kind of agenda by asking all these, questions that are meaningless, because they only go to show that the people asking the question are ignorant or have a particular agenda in mind. And I don't really know that it's our job to educate these people. If they want to be educated, fine. If they want to remain ignorant, then they can remain ignorant. I mean, we need to educate some people, that's for sure. When there's a sincere conversation with our neighbors, with our family members, with elected officials, then we need to be prepared, and we need, so we can educate. That, yes. But I would say most of the time, these questions are brought up by people who want to score some kind of a silly point. The Holocaust, the largest anti-Zionist Jewish community in the world are descendants of Holocaust survivors. These are the Jews who live up in New York and Brooklyn, the ultra-Orthodox Jews. That entire community are descendants of Hungarian Jews who survived Auschwitz. They are the most vocal, clear, anti-Zionist community on earth. Hedy Epstein and others who passed away already, who were Holocaust survivors and were very vocal in their opposition to Zionism and to the state of Israel. Not to mention the fact that out of 2 million Jewish refugees after World War II, only a fraction actually went to Palestine, to what became Israel. The vast majority either went back home to Europe or came to America or went somewhere else. I mean, the Holocaust survivors, with their own feet, said what they think about Israel. They didn't go. Israel tried to take them, and many of the ones that did go or were young when they were taken, because Israel took all the youth, the survivors, as soon as they were 18, they got the hell out because they couldn't stand the racism and the treatment that they received by the Zionists. And so the Holocaust argument is ridiculous. And besides, if you're fighting intolerance, how does creating another racist state in somebody else's country help? If we want to eliminate intolerance and racism and genocide, we need to create an environment of tolerance, not another environment where there is no tolerance for the other. So these are all, these are kind of form questions that are I think they're mailed to activists to bring up. If somebody asked me once, where will the Jews go? If once this Palestine is a democratic state, where will the Jews go? And my reply was, why do you want them to go? Why do you want them to go? Why should they go? I mean, this idea that somehow because Jews are no longer the masters, the Palestinians are the underlings, that somehow Jews have to leave. I mean, if they want to leave, leave. But why do they have to leave? Why can't the Israeli Jews, I'm talking about Israelis really. And I differentiate Israelis and Jews. To me, Israelis are a very particular thing. The Israelis are the people, Israeli Jews, like myself and so on. Are they not able to live in a real democracy? If they don't want to live in an Arab country with Arab neighbors, then why did they come there in the first place? I mean, you can't come to a country and then complain about the neighbors. Yeah, they live in the center of the Arab world. The Zionists chose an Arab country that is in the center of the Arab world, with an incredibly important significance to Arabs and Muslims. And then they complain that there are Arabs and Muslims all around. Well, why did they come there to begin with? There was this attempt to create a law that prohibits the muezzin, the call for prayer. And one of the arguments that the state of Israel made was, look, even in Europe, they prevented it. Like in Switzerland and other countries, they eliminated it. Well, if you want to live in Europe, go to Europe. What are you doing in an Arab country? Palestinians, the local people, this is part of the culture. There's a call to prayer. If you don't want it, why did you come to this country to begin with? So yeah, of course, there's lots of Arabs and Muslims there. It's an Arab country. It's in the heart of the Arab world, and it has enormous significance. It's not some piece of desert somewhere in the middle of nowhere. This is a place of enormous significance to all Arabs and all Muslims. If you don't like it there, go somewhere else.
Amen. And following up with that, what kind of contradictions do liberal Israelis experience on a daily basis? Will this lead to any change in Israeli politics?
Will what lead to change?
Not sure. But what kind of contradictions do liberal Israelis experience on a daily basis?
Well, Israeli liberals are the contradiction. I mean, to be a Zionist liberal is a contradiction in terms. You're either a Zionist or you're a liberal, or a left Zionist. You can't be left and a Zionist. It's an oxymoron. When I meet with people like that, they usually say to me, you know what, you're so extreme. I agree with you 95% of the stuff. And I'm thinking, damn that 5%. That's precisely the 5% that says that we and the Palestinians have the same rights. And that's exactly where liberal Israelis fall off where the argument falls off the tracks. Yeah, we can't give them everything. We can't give them exactly the same rights as us. You don't really mean that. That's a typical kind of conversation that I have. I agree with you 95%, but why do you have to be so extreme? To say that the Palestinians deserve the same rights as we do, the same privileges we do, is extreme, then that's the end of the conversation. To say that it's okay to bomb Gaza because of Hamas, to kill children because Hamas is in Gaza, that's the end of the conversation. If those are your values, then, you can call yourself liberal or left, but you're not liberal or left if you support these kinds of things. So the term Zionist left or Zionist liberal, Israeli liberal or Israeli left is an oxymoron, and really there's very few of them that are left. I mean, very, very few today, because the discourse in Israel is between, like I said, the extreme right that is kind of secular and the extreme right that's a little more religious. And there's really no conversation beyond that. And the worst thing, and both sides call each other lefty. That's the worst slur that they throw at each other, is calling each other a lefty. So Bennett is calling Netanyahu a lefty, and Netanyahu is calling Bennett a lefty. That's the worst thing you can say about anyone. And I follow these guys, on social media, and I read the papers, and whether it's the press, whether it's the politicians in the Knesset, whether it's people in the street, that's the conversation. How dare you talk like a lefty? And an Arab lover, being an Arab lover.
I think you can see something like that here too, being called a liberal or
oh yeah,
a lefty from the liberals. We are doing our last call for questions, and we have a question from Judy. I know you've talked about your book list, but Judy was saying, is there a layperson book you can recommend for my book club who are ignorant for the most part of the Palestinian situation? Informative, but not too technical or heavy. To clarify this last question, just one book rather than a list.
You want fiction or nonfiction? I would say if it's nonfiction, go to Palestine 4,000 Year History by Noor Masalha, who is a Palestinian, very renowned historian. If I would say you want fiction, then I would read The Time of White Horses by Ibrahim Nasrallah.
Thank you. And we can find those also on your list.
Yeah.
Great. Our last question, kind of, I guess, adding into the action, because we want people to listen to this and take action and not just leave and continue thinking about it. Well, obviously continue thinking about it, but think and act. What are major indicators for the BDS movement that we can monitor for success?
I don't know what specifically. I mean, it might say something on their web. I'm not sure. I think if you go on my website and look at some of the webinars that I've done with people who are, by and large, big supporters of BDS as a concept, as the idea, there are a lot of indicators. I mean, if you ask me personally, I think I think the day that Israelis cannot participate in the Olympics, in the World Cup, in academic conferences, in any kind of artistic, cultural events, that's going to be a good day. That's really what we should be striving for. And then that Israeli diplomats are gradually sent home, capital after capital around the world. I think that's what needs to happen. I think that would be a good indicator that we're on the right track.
Thank you so much, Miko. You've said a lot, and it's all setting the bar as to where we should be. And I will now switch over to the president, Janet.
Did anyone hear me? Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. I was talking and I realized I was muted. I thank you as well, Miko. It's hard to put into words the frustration that we all feel, but I think one of the things that you have said over and over is that we do have some power as individuals, and we need to take that power. And that's a very profound statement to make. Your request for all of us to be engaged through action is a cornerstone of the principles of Middle East Peace Now. You've clearly stated what our responsibility is in exposing the truth. A reminder to complete the very short evaluation, whose link may be found in the sidebar. Please, please, please take the 3 minutes or so that is required to complete this evaluation. We really value your opinions, audience, so we appreciate that. The forum has been recorded and will be posted on our website within about a week, along with a link to register for next month's forum, and watch the website and our MailChimp mailings for what that forum will be. For now, since Minnesota continues to deal with increased COVID cases, we will continue to present our forums via Zoom. And finally, if you're new to Middle East Peace Now forums and like what you see and hear, please consider becoming a member through donation and/or our yearly dues. We are participating in Give to the Max Day, November 18th, sponsored by givemin.org, and a link has been posted in the chat for you to give in this way, or you may give directly by writing a check to Middle East Peace Now. You can check mepn.org for the PO box for that way to send a donation or dues. On behalf of the MEPN board, we thank you all for your support, and thank you again, Miko, for your very enlightening talk. And I wish you all a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.